In the previous episode, we looked on the technicalities of how the data on fertility is being used to push agendas and the common mythologies derived from these agendas. In this episode, we'll look at individual and collective factors that depress or encourage fertility in a statistically noticeable way, as well as more personal and identifiable realities about the people who support both positions. You see, the world is not the Oxford Debate Society. In politics, just because you're right doesn't mean that much. If that had been the case, then a lot of the atrocities in our history would have never happened. Incidentally, if being right was all it took, antinatalism would have never existed and this series would have never had to be made. So, who says what also matters, and for the time being, the antinatalists are better at this. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the second installment of the Fertility and Demographics series here on the Freedom Alternative. So, after understanding the basics, it's time to look on who says what and why, as well as slowly move into the factors that influence fertility in a way that most who talk about this refuse to look at. I'm sure I'll ruffle a lot of jimmies here and there, and I suspect I'll get a lot of hate mail, but this has been a request for many years. As I was saying in the first episode, I read a lot of both pro-natalist and antinatalist content for months preparing for this series. The ticket related to this series is also, I think, the longest since I've been maintaining a ticketing system. So, without further ado, Chapter 1, Pro-Natalists as People. Now, there are multiple reasons for why pro-natalists aren't making any serious gains pretty much anywhere. The biggest one being that the demographic momentum simply doesn't favor their position. However, pro-natalists struggle even to convince people, at least in principle, of the validity of their position. And that happens even when a position is very clearly reasonable. Now, why is that? Is it just that pro-natalists are bad at propaganda? Well, yes, but it's not just that. Here's an example. This account on X is very big on pro-natalists, and they say, quote, a major local problem in America is freezing property taxes for elderly suburbanites who then live in their homes forever. This both deprives schools of funding and denies homes to young families. Empty nesters should really pay extra tax to encourage them to downsize and move. Are you 75 and living in a 3,000 square foot $1 million home alone with your spouse in a top school district? Your property taxes should be like $50,000 per year. You will enact pro-natal tax policy or the fertility rate will get worse, unquote. Now, is any of that reasonable? Nobody except underdeveloped weirdos is convinced by that. If your pro-natalist policy pronouncement is inherently about let's intentionally kill old people or have them live as nomads, then your policy is a no-go anywhere. Not to mention that this basically makes the same wrong assumption that antinatalists have made 50 years ago, this Malthusian mentality that is incredibly cancerous. Antinatalists predicted 50 to 60 years ago that there will be mass famines due to overpopulation. They thought even 5 billion people on Earth will trigger apocalyptic events, but none of that happened, and we're closer to 9 billion people who also live longer, statistically, than we used to live in the 1960s. Now you have pro-natalists believing that pro-fertility policies must be explicitly communist, basically, or else the newly created youth won't have a place to live. Such violent rhetoric is not only repulsive, but a good argument in itself against pro-natalism. Who would want to adopt a philosophy that is so inherently anti-human? The trouble is that the overwhelming majority of those who shill pronatalism on the internet tick at least two of the following boxes: 0 children, single, autist, niche or degenerate interests, spends less time outdoors than a convicted serial killer, net receiver of state subsidies, and anonymous. I mean, seriously, just think about it. Name one pronatalist shill that does not fit at least two of these. Most of them fit more than two. Elon Musk, the biggest pronatalist shill, is multiple times divorced, autistic, and until recently a net receiver of state subsidies. Besides, do you really want Elon Musk as a role model of fatherhood? Like, really? A world in which fathers are like Elon Musk is a world you really, really wouldn't want to live in. Elon Musk is great on many things, don't get me wrong, but not on this one. And then you have the more, let's call it, general variety. Almost all of the pronatalist shills online are anonymous. Yes, I know, everyone has a good reason. In fact, this series is the result of a back and forth with a donor who remains anonymous. I understand his reasons, but when all is said and done, you get taken less seriously if you're anonymous. I know, it's not fair. Well, tough. Life is not fair. There is a place for anonymous discourse, don't get me wrong. A lot of the great ideas in history started with anonymous letters, so don't confuse me with those who say nobody should be anonymous. But once you put your idea out there, the idea will not be forwarded anonymously. That's not how this works. Someone of sufficient enough virtue will have to take it on his own and forward it, not anonymously. And this is especially true with something so personal as having children. You may think it's irrational, but it is ultimately understandable when most people react with, okay, how many children do you have? When attacked or shamed by someone anonymous over this issue. To drive the point home about how repulsive too many pronatalists are, here's this thread. The author is a Korean woman who shares an article she wrote following interviews with regretful parents. That is to say, people who had children and wish they hadn't. The responses by self-proclaimed pronatalists are nothing short of repulsive and in and of themselves an argument for antinatalism. They blame otherwise functional parents of all sorts of mostly imaginary ills. Because, again, the interviews are with people who did step up and raise their children, but in retrospect, they think it wasn't the best choice for them to have children in the first place. You may disagree, but it is their right to believe so. And besides, they already did what you wanted them to do. They had kids and raised them well, all despite not wanting them fully. So the correct natalist shill response to an article like this is, oh well, we all have regrets. It's admirable that they stepped up to the task and did the right thing. It's only human to have doubts and regrets. Kudos to these parents. That would be the sane answer. The actual natalist shill response to this article is, well, just look at the thread yourselves. It's a collection of repulsiveness. The most common response is that you cannot love your child and prefer if they didn't exist. These are mutually exclusive propositions, say the anonymous pronatalist shills on Twitter. And I'm like, oh, sweet summer child. Do you actually think that in the 1700s, for instance, parents loved all of their 8 children as a norm? Like, for real? Heck. Up until 50 or 100 years ago, the death of a child wasn't even a big deal, or at least not the big deal that it is today, because it was happening often. The majority of families globally had at least one child die as late as the 1960s. That doesn't mean they didn't love them or didn't care, but it does mean they do what they could with the hand they were dealt. Same goes for regretful parents who do raise their kids well, as those interviewed in the Time magazine article. They did their best under the circumstances, even while they'd preferred things had turned out differently. Ultimately, one still needs to get that there's a lot of gray. There's many nuances. There's people who clearly don't want children at all, no matter what it takes. Then there's people who absolutely want children at all costs, and these two nearly always get their way. And then there's the bigger category of people who have doubts. That is the category pronatalists should target. And that category, for now, gets some empathy from the antinatalists and scorn and condemnation from pronatalists. And as long as things stay that way, that bigger category of people will continue to be majority childless for longer and longer. And that's because pronatalists rarely invest in their position. The ideal pronatalist shill would look something like this. Has 3 kids between the ages of 10 and 14, is still married to the original father or mother of all 3, has mainstream interests, spends more time outdoors than a convicted serial killer, so that is more than 2 hours a day, is a net taxpayer or otherwise a net contributor, and is obviously not a socialist. Now get a few of these, and then, and only then, can pronatalists start claiming that they need to be taken seriously. Now again, this will happen eventually, but I think it will take another decade or so, maybe even more. But even when this will happen, this is still a necessary but not a sufficient condition, because it's a high bar. Look, I am a close acquaintance, or friends, or whatever, with 24 people who have 3 children or more, and I'm somewhat pals with another 30-ish in similar conditions. None of them would ever even think about shilling pronatalism, and more than half of them actually regret having that many children. Now, does that mean that they hate their children or don't love them? No, of course not. But it does mean that the trade-offs of having 3 children or more are not negligible, and they do show up in the lives of both parents and children. Antinatalists are routinely lambasted for exaggerating the toil of having children, and for good reason. We'll get to them shortly. But pronatalists' intentional obliviousness to the trade-offs of their position is just as bad. And it gets worse. A lot of the pronatalist obsessions are just weird and besides the point. It's usually not long in any conversation with nearly any online pronatalist until you find yourself discussing autistic nonsense like the ridiculously cartoonish takes on the so-called mouse utopia. Mouse utopia, as I'm sure most of you know, is the internet term for the Calhoun experiment conducted 62 years ago, which gave birth to the behavioral sink theory. His ideas have been revived by various weird online echo chambers as a catch-all explanation for declining fertility, mainly because Calhoun himself described his research in anthropomorphic terms to get his ideas more credibility with the masses. What present-day promoters of the Calhoun experiments as a catch-all explanation for current ills seem to forget is that Calhoun himself was an antinatalist. Remember, this is 1962. Around the same time when elite opinion was concerned with overpopulation. We already know that everything they believed about that was wrong. 100% of their predictions on population levels, economics, famine, everything turned out wrong. So in that climate, Mr. Calhoun made some of his own predictions with the exact same bias and while holding the exact same beliefs himself. But all of that is ignored by the proponents of the Calhoun experiment as some sort of a biblical premonition about the future of mankind. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the Calhoun experiment is without merit, but I am saying that its applicability to humans is far more limited than Calhoun himself may have wanted to imply. I mean, for starters, there's a self-evident one. Humans aren't mice. And experiments on humans to assess the effects of density on human behavior have in fact been conducted multiple times from the 1970s onwards, and all of them came up with results that pretty much say, well, it's a lot more complicated than that, but there are no appreciable negative results overall. So that's how the theory died, until the internet revived it because there does seem to be a place on Earth where some of Calhoun's conclusions appear to be confirmed. That place being, of course, South Korea. But then again, if that is the case, that why does this phenomenon seem to be absent in Tel Aviv, Addis Ababa, Almaty, Samarkand or Lagos? Although, to be fair, the total fertility rate in Lagos, while big, is still smaller than the country overall. Also, how does this explain my country, where the majority of new children are actually born in cities? Almost all of the growth in fertility in my country over the last 15 years comes from cities, not villages and communes. If Calhoun's theory is so great at predicting the future, why was it unable to predict the future of pretty much any city for decades and now only works in Seoul? I don't know the answer to that. But the proponents of the mouse utopia experiment as a valid source of wisdom aren't doing themselves any favors by ignoring the vast majority of mankind, which doesn't conform to the suppositions of Calhoun's theory. You think Seoul is crammed? Well, okay, fine, it is, but have you ever been to Lagos or Shanghai or Manila? Heck, in a few weeks I will be in Bogota, Colombia, which is the 12th most crowded city in the world. I'll show you what crammed really means. Seoul is in fact half as crammed as Bogota is. And the reason I give these examples is because there seems to be a correlation here that pronatalists would be very well served to investigate, but they won't because it doesn't fit the narrative. You would think how happy the kids are kind of matters, right? Well, as it turns out, the happiest kids are those in upper middle income countries, with the leaders being the kids in Colombia, Romania and Israel. The least happy kids are in the wealthiest places, especially South Korea. In fact, kids in all upper middle income countries far outpace in happiness both the kids in very wealthy countries and everyone else except Ethiopia, which is a special case showing a more wealthy pattern consistent with the national mood. Now, why is that? Well, a pronatalist that is serious will want to ask, what do those places do right? But that won't happen anytime soon because, as mentioned at the beginning of this series, the whole conversation is polluted with militant materialism and Amerocentrism. The very idea that maybe, just maybe, the line doesn't have to always go up is anathema to these people. So, there's that. The most popular pronatalist account on X, called simply More Births, is a source of entertainment at this point. His solution to low fertility in cities is to build suburban sprawl. This is such a myopic American take that it's hilarious to even talk about. I mean, he applies American logic to New Zealand or Macau and wonders why even his friends laugh at him. I mean, the guy seriously says apartments in Macau are cheap, and thus this proves that it's not the price of housing that affects fertility, but density itself. Now, there's just one problem. Apartments in Macau are not cheap at all. An apartment good enough to raise one child is rented at 120% of the median income. But, like any online pronatalists, let's not let reality stand in the way of a good story, right? And then his solution is also hilarious and ignores one fact that even most Americans aren't aware of, which is that limitless suburban sprawl in the United States is not the result of free market or free choices, but the result of intentional social engineering via subsidies. Which is funny because suburbanites are most likely to lament about welfare leeches and the character of their suburb, when in reality suburbanites are the biggest welfare leeches, and left to the forces of the market, the character of most suburbs will be the same one of abandoned villages in Europe to be sold for $1 per dozens of houses in the hope that someone finds something useful to do with all of that. The idea that suburbs are the answer to fertility is not just US-centric nonsense, but it is also anti-historical. Historically, villages were where kids thrived in big numbers, not suburbs. Now, I could go on like this for hours, but I think I've made my point. The loudest and most common pronatalist talking points are either straight up factually wrong or just weird and who appeal to the least relevant people, both culturally and demographically. Yeah, tech bros like all of this, so what? What is the total fertility rate of tech bros? Most tech bros are forever virgins, for crying out loud. Heck, even the most coherent pronatalist conglomerate, which would be the Natal Conference, are still overwhelmingly childless weirdos and nerds themselves. Yeah, sure, Politico is cringe by calling them far right, but the slander sticks because, well, they are weird. And there's no way around that. If you think you're gonna convince the general culture to value parenthood more and thus lead to people having more children with weird stories about mouse utopias, then what can I say? Good luck with that. I'll be looking for someone to hold the bet that you will fail. Because the only time in history, the only times when fertility was turned around intentionally was when parenthood was made cool and easy, or at least easier, and not when weirdos tried to impose their ideas through the force of the state or through other versions of shaming. I already showed in the previous episode what the Islamic Republic of Iran experienced once the weirdos got into power. That is the expected result anywhere where weirdos get into power. Alright, now let's get to the other facet. 2. Antinatalists as people. The only reason antinatalists aren't winning the cultural battle anymore is because they routinely end up being just as weird as the pronatalists. There are very few antinatalists who don't tick at least 2 of the following boxes: corporate drone, techno-optimist, climate catastrophist, gender ambivalent, delayed adolescent, ideological extremist. Seriously, think of all the serious committed antinatalists you know. Find one that doesn't fit at least 2 of these. I'm not saying they don't exist, but I'm saying they're very rare. Remember, here we're talking about explicit pronatalists and explicit antinatalists, not about people who have or don't have children. I feel I should repeat this more often because, well, it's usually a good idea, but I'll trust this esteemed audience to be able to follow without constant reminders. Anyway, given the current context, there isn't much of a need to have consistent antinatalists in public, so this is perhaps why their numbers are so skewed. Nevertheless, antinatalists are still more successful because they are able to introduce their propaganda in normal settings without necessarily appearing weird. For instance, here's an excerpt from a Guardian article about questioning whether to have kids or not. Quote, "I'm about to meet a friend for lunch when an ad catches my eye. It features a woman about my age wearing a blazer and, like me, clutching a takeaway coffee cup. Live today, try later," it reads. You do you. The ad is for free egg freezing events, limited spaces available, like a mass harvesting, I think. The image stays with me as I alight the train, unquote. And then the author goes on to list the common antinatalist talking points. But look closer. The biggest antinatalist propaganda is not online, but offline, with a mixture of techno-optimism, which is very common among antinatalists. Live today, try later. What an effective and insidious message to depress fertility. It doesn't even read like a propaganda ad. And at least in theory, it isn't one, right? I mean, it's an ad for egg freezing services. In theory, a pro-fertility business, right? Well, except in reality, the success rate of such procedures is very low, while the procedures themselves are brutally expensive. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't exist. In fact, in the 3rd episode, I'll make the case for them. But I am saying that the commercials for it are inherently antinatalist. You see, there is a reason antinatalist propaganda targets women, and no, it's not because women gestate and give birth to children. The reason is because women are more neurotic than men. By how much, there's still a debate and depends on how the study is conducted, but nobody seriously disagrees that the average woman is more neurotic than the average man. And as such, all you have to do as an antinatalist is to trigger that neuroticism in relation to having a child. Statistically, you'll get more women thinking about it for long enough that their fertility window has closed. It really is that simple. And it's something to which, slowly, left-wing former antinatalists are coming to terms with. Here's the Washington Post reviewing a moderately pro-natalist left-wing book. Quote, I love this book, which is much too complex and subtle to summarize here. It gave me so much to think about and in new ways. I'm glad I had my daughter decades before it was written, though, so I didn't have to take into consideration the possible interests of her pre-existent self and the role I've played in ruining the earth by having her. The ambivalent women Berg and Weisman write about should read it, if only to further complicate their thinking, because van der Lucht gives no answers to her questions. But they should also be sure to read the last chapter of What Are Children For?, in which Berg describes her own decision to have a baby and the intensity and heat and passion and continuing conflicts of new motherhood. If it doesn't make them want to throw away their birth control, then they should just lay the whole issue to rest and move on, unquote. Such an astonishing admission on the Washington Post, no less, would have been unimaginable 15 years ago. What the author is really saying is that if she had been subjected to antinatalist propaganda, she wouldn't have had her daughter. I take this as a good sign, quite frankly. Maybe in another decade or so we will finally move past this obsession that concerns about fertility are a left-right issue. Hey, I'm allowed to dream too, right? Now, on a more serious note, antinatalists have the advantage of being in most institutions, and as such, antinatalist propaganda doesn't have to be explicit. It can be implicit, like triggering young women's neuroticism, or via ads to, ironically, fertility services, or even unmentioned. All of the climate change catastrophism is ultimately an antinatalist pursuit. It may even be the case that it's not intentional, but the results are what they are. By comparison, street-level antinatalists are just as effective as street-level pronatalists, which is to say, not much. The level of financial support for initiatives like Stop Having Kids is negligible. Still, please notice one thing. They do try their best to use not weird people in their activism. This is probably the only good thing I have to say about antinatalists, but it's also a very serious one. Unlike pronatalists, antinatalists are not prima facie repulsive. They only become repulsive when they open their mouths and you start parsing what exactly are they saying. This helps them in getting their points across whenever they pick the correct venue. Luckily for everyone, they rarely do pick the correct venue. Alright, now on to my favorite part, Chapter 3, Depressing Fertility Factors, which is a nice way of saying dogshit ideas that make things worse. You see, there is such thing as the tyranny of small decisions. A lot more often than both antinatalists and pronatalists are willing to admit, fertility trends are driven by these seemingly disparate small decisions that over the long run do depress fertility. And these seemingly small and disparate decisions do have a compounding effect. Basically, we've been making fertility depressing decisions for about 150 years now. Most people don't realize, but the vast majority of the ideas floated in public about child rearing and young people are really new. Even most so-called conservatives in fact peddle ideas and practices that are no older than 150 years. Yes, I know exceptions do exist, but the norm is how I describe it. Now, you may say this isn't inherently a bad thing, but I will say this. The vast majority of human history happened before 1850. Nearly 100% of people that ever lived on this earth grew up under a set of expectations and in a way of life that is alien to nearly 100% of the people alive today. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I am saying that ideas have consequences, and you can't adopt and then make normative ideas that were unheard of 5 minutes ago, civilizationally speaking, and expect to have no impact either on fertility or on the culture in general. Roger Scruton used to say, quote, "The strange superstition has arisen in the Western world that we can start all over again, remaking human nature, human society, and the possibilities of happiness as though the knowledge and experience of our ancestors were now entirely irrelevant," unquote. And nowhere is this more evident than in the realm of fertility and child rearing. So, without further ado, let's go through the long list. Number 1, insane financial expectations. The reason so many people buy into natal socialism as a potentially good policy is because they commit the sin of assuming shit. In particular, assuming that what people say or their stated preferences are equally valid to what people do or their revealed preferences. It's a common mistake. If you ask childless people why they don't have kids, a significant minority, at the very least, will cite financial concerns. That, my friends, is simply not true. If that were true, you would have only the rich having kids. The cope with this fact is that the poor are just too stupid to know better. But just that doesn't cut it anymore, given that poor now has, multiple definitions. I mean, people making $30,000 a year are considered poor in some parts of the world. That's an immense achievement, but it should also change the way we look at poverty. At $30K a year, you are not poor the way those living on $30 a month are. And treating those two cases as if they're somehow the same is a common upper middle class mistake. Also, as shown in the previous episode, just giving people more money does not yield better results. So clearly, people's revealed preferences are that they simply don't want any more kids. Now, that's not to say let's throw our hands in the air and say что делать, ничего делать, but there is to say that we should look deeper. And by that, I mean expectations. It's not that people don't have enough money to raise kids. Most absolutely do. What happens is that their overall expectations on both their own lives and what it takes to raise a child are out of sync with reality. Here's this amazing graph. Inflation-adjusted spending on children's clothes in the United States. This graph makes the case by itself on how messed up the expectations have become. Clothes overall have gotten cheaper, in fact way cheaper, anywhere in the world. Yet spending on clothes for children increased by, 35-fold in the US? None of this is the fault of feminism, pornography, birth control, or whatever other vice cited by pronatalists. All of this is the fault of the line goes up mentality. The idea that your life's worth and your worth as a parent is measured by how much you make and how much you spend. I see this all the time. $1,000 for a crib? That's insane. What's wrong with the $100 one? Or even better, what's wrong with reusing the one that your neighbor or friend is no longer using because their kid has outgrown it? That is how we used to do things until 5 minutes ago, civilizationally speaking. Same goes for clothes and toys and so on and so forth, especially in the very early stages of life when they grow pretty damn fast and stuff becomes obsolete in weeks or months. Heck, I played with some of my older brother's toys. Trust me, I wasn't traumatized by that. What he couldn't destroy, I did, and that was that. And these unreasonable expectations seep into a lot of other decisions that parents make. I convinced the father of a few weeks ago not to get a smartphone for his 12-year-old daughter. How did I do that? By showing him that he's basically being manipulated by his daughter. You see, kids will learn pretty damn fast what are the weaknesses of their parents, and they will proceed to exploit those mercilessly. The way kids are doing it here is to try to really hard to convince their parents that all of their schoolmates have some expensive toys and they're just missing out. Poor dad was saving up money to buy his daughter a phone that was way in excess of $1,500. And I was like, mate, if you want to spend that money on your daughter, then put it in her savings account, but under no circumstance should you buy what she asks. There's no way all of her colleagues in a neighborhood school have $1,500 phones. But even if that were true, just because other parents are dumb doesn't mean you have to be. And surprise, surprise, the kid was full of shit and had learned that threatening to suffer from bullying was her parents' weakness. I'm sure the kid hates me now for talking her father out from an irrational expense, but you can imagine how much I care. Point being, those who consider having children look at all of this and get an inflated mental image of just how much it costs to raise a child. And that has a depressing effect on fertility. Now, I'm sure some of the people hearing this will say yes, but that is at the end of the day the parents' fault, and of course you would be right, but it doesn't change the fact that these unreasonable expectations do have a depressing effect on fertility. Number 2, education. See, this one is the most controversial of all. Up until 2 minutes ago, civilizationally speaking, we would do education of children totally differently. In present day, we steal away their childhood, expose them to increased risk of suicide, put them in carceral institutions, and then we expect them to want children of their own later on in life. Are we out of our fucking minds? And the answer is yes. The most extreme cases are, of course, in South Korea. If I were a South Korean, I would be a militant antinatalist, no joke about that. Or would work to emigrate and have children somewhere else that is, well, less of a mental asylum. It's straight up insane the way children are being stressed and, yes, I'll go ahead and say it, oppressed in the Korean system. Japan isn't far away either. And believe it or not, most people make a decision on whether they want kids or not sometime during their teenage years. And they rarely change their minds one way or the other. And it's not just Korea or Japan. In some countries of Europe, it is more or less mandatory to be in an institution from as early as age 5 to age 18. In practice, 30 to 35% of young people in Europe end up being in an institution from age 3 to age 23. France being the worst example, where compulsory education starts at age 3 and ends at age 18. 15 years, the entirety of conscious childhood, all of it thrown away in a state institution. There is simply no way you can convince me that this is a good thing. Both in Europe and in North America, one of the predictors of suicide rates in children is whether today is a school day or not. Same goes for Japan, by the way. The current society straight up tortures children. And then we're surprised Pikachu face when they grow up as adults and decide that having children is cruelty. Really? Are we really that surprised? For real? The worse and longer schools have gotten, the less enthusiastic those kids came out and less likely to want to have kids of their own later on. The only reason this has gotten so bad is because the school systems were tweaked primarily with adults in mind. It's convenient for the parents to just drop their kids at age 3 somewhere else and come back for them 8-9 hours later. But lo and behold, the kids themselves don't agree. And when it's their turn to make a decision, they will decide something else. And a lot of this is recent. Just 20 years ago, the average compulsory education in Europe was 8 years. Today, the countries that mandate the least amount of torture of their children are Poland, Slovenia, and Serbia, which have only 9 years of compulsory education. Even that is extreme by historical standards. Most of everyone else's policies in Europe are fully mental. By the way, this is also the reason you get the impression that schools have gotten worse, because they're basically daycares now. What's the point to strive for excellence if nobody gets kicked out? In fact, it's illegal to kick out students in Europe, and things that used to require 3 or 4 years are now stretched over a decade or more. It's all one giant employment scheme for the teachers' unions. And everyone knows it, but we're supposed to continue to pretend that this isn't the case, lest we appear as anti-education. Oh, the language has been corrupted as well. Up until 30 seconds ago, civilizationally speaking, we used to make a distinction between instruction and education. Instruction is what was done in schools. Education is what the family provided. The word instruction has pretty much disappeared, and education is now conflated, whichever way the state thinks it's right to do. All right. Number 3. Cities that suck. Pro-natalists want to point out that there is a correlation between cities and lower fertility, but they never zoom in to notice that the correlation is not uniform, and in fact it is inverse in some cities. So maybe, just maybe, look at those cities that don't suck and notice what they do right. How about that? Trouble is that once we do that, we then have to conclude that US centrism of this online debate is straight up toxic, and certainly our American friends don't want to hear that. but it's still true, and the gap is widening. Nearly every city in the world is trying its best to become more human-centric. Poor countries, middle-income countries, rich countries, doesn't matter. Pretty much everyone is building new or better public transport, new and bigger parks and public spaces, less room for cars, more accessibility for existing stuff via public transport rather than kilometers of queues of cars, and so on and so forth. Everyone except North America and Australia. Maybe they're all stupid, but what if they're not? North American cities are dystopian for the most part and impossible to navigate without a car. So what is a 15-year-old supposed to do? Well, in Europe, he or she takes the train to somewhere else. In North America, if he or she doesn't have a friend who has a car and a license, then tough luck. He's stuck at home until mommy can give a lift. Anti-human cities effectively depress fertility by adding extra responsibilities to parents. In Europe, kids walk, bike, or take the public transport to school and to everywhere else, even now with so many new cars being bought. And even those who don't, at the very least, they still have the option. But no such option exists in North America. But then North America gets a disproportionate influence in the discourse about this topic, and when we combine that with the general ignorance of your average American commentator, we get ridiculous takes. Still, cities that suck are the problem and the depressing factor to fertility. Not cities in general by themselves. Just the cities that suck. It just so happens that most of the cities that suck are in North America. Anyway, number 4. Anti-youth culture and bias. Now this one is pretty straightforward. We've made compulsory school longer and worse, so it's convenient for adults. We've made public spaces unavailable via loitering laws. We've made socializing spots impossible to maintain via ridiculous regulation and taxation. Heck, we've made intentionally child-free public spaces, all to the convenience of adults. Now that's all fine and dandy, but when was the last time your city did something for the explicit benefits of the very least teenagers, and God forbid, at the same time, mildly inconvenient for adults? If I start talking about these things, there will be a huge amount of adults who will vehemently denounce this as somehow bad. Still, the reason my city is one of the most youthful in Europe is because any 10-year-old can safely navigate it, play outside for free on up-to-date sports facilities, and it's very walkable and safe to walk even late into the night. Now, as I'm taping this, the summer is almost over, but it was pretty common last month to stumble upon teenagers in parks way after 1 a.m., especially in the very hot nights during the heat waves. Now, good luck doing that in the United States or in Shanghai. And it's not just my city. Every single city in Romania has been doing this lately, and in the process increase the quality of life for everyone, not just the convenience of adults. However, all of this would be controversial in North America. The reactions I see online from random Americans whenever someone dares to let their kids play on the streets are jaw-dropping. There is an apocryphal say attributed to Camille Paglia that in America we treat college students like children, children like infants, and fetuses like trash. And it's true, but it's not just America. Although Europe does some things better than the United States when it comes to youth issues, overall Europe also suffers from the same problem. You're considered youth for some EU projects all the way till age 34. This is basically anti-youth bias disguised as a pro-youth concern. So we're wondering why 30-year-olds behave like children? Well, why wouldn't they? You keep them locked up in institutions from age 3 to 18, and then you expect them not to try to catch up and recover somehow the lost time? Really? Alrighty, number 5. Terminally online encouragements. Fortunately, this is finally being addressed, but an entire generation has already been affected. So it's a long road to recovering from this. Finally, more and more spaces are starting to treat smartphone usage as the disease that it actually is. Also, the ridiculous digitalization programs are finally being phased out. Still, You get tens of millions of young people who quite literally don't know how to write a note because handwriting hasn't been taught. And as it turns out, this has a lot of downstream consequences. And it's not just about cursive itself. It turns out that 250 or 300 years ago, when we came up with the idea of a classicist education, and by the way, I should make a video about classicist education. I will, I promise. It's just going to take a while. But anyway, when we came up with that idea, those people weren't thinking just at immediately measurable skills, but also at more subtle ones. Handwriting develops fine motor skills, activates and trains various portions of the brain that deal with memory, and helps the individual develop the basic thought patterns concerned with something we conventionally think of as basic thinking. Now, what does that have to do with fertility? Well, let's put it this way. Tens of millions of Zoomers are now in the fertile interval, and they were never taught how to write with a pen on paper. And a lot of them, and even more of alphas, have also been through the supremely dogshit idea and experiment called remote learning, which depressed the acquiescence of basic skills even more. The oldest alpha cohort will be 15 in a few months. That is to say, they will join the fertile interval cohorts. If you think people who've never learned basic skills but were kept indoors for 15 to 20 years have spent less time outdoors than a maximum security inmate and have been exposed to internet brain rot all of this time, if you think these people will have normal fertility patterns, I have a bridge to sell to you. Now, don't get me wrong, I hope I will be proven wrong on this, but I sincerely doubt. Literacy is not a necessary condition for healthy fertility, obviously, as evidenced by thousands of years of history. But the semi-literates or the illiterates from 1824 would get to learn a lot of the basic facts of life by simply living it normally outside. That hasn't been happening anymore in way too many places on Earth, and not just in the West. And it's not just handwriting. Compare adolescent forums from 1999. A lot of them are still available and queryable to this day, by the way. So the takes by young people in 2024, compared to those of 1999, takes on everything, on life, on spare time, and yes, on love, sex, and family formation. Not only they don't resemble, but they're diametrically opposed, with the current ones being excessively nihilistic and pessimistic. Now, of course, every time I bring this up, I am reminded of Socrates' quote about children who now love luxury and have bad manners, contempt for authority, show disrespect for elders, and love chatter in place of exercise. That's what Socrates used to say, and which is fair, up to a point. Yeah, that's fair. However, just because something is often repeated and often wrong, it doesn't mean it's always wrong. And again, I offer a way to compare. Compare the takes of teenagers in late 1990s to the takes of teenagers in late 2000s, and those of teenagers of today, of 2024. You will see the first two don't differ that much on their fundamentals, while the latter differs by quite a lot, and routinely for the worse. You do that yourself in your country, and you will immediately notice what I'm talking about. Anyway, I won't dwell more on this because I already made a video on this called the Terminally Online and Prolonged Adolescence. Links, of course, in the description. Number 6, safetyism. This one is probably the number one depressing factor of fertility. 9 years ago, I made a video called Most of My Childhood is Now Illegal. Since then, things have only marginally improved in some places, but overall, things have in fact gotten worse. 30 or 40 years ago, you would expect the 10-year-old to look out for the 80-year-old sibling, and especially during summertime, they would fuck off in the morning with a few bucks in their pockets and would come back at 10 p.m. or later. Well, this is still being done. In my country, in Czechia, in Serbia, and in France. Unsurprisingly, these will be also the countries of Europe with stable fertility. This is also the norm in Central Asia and Israel. In far too many places, however, legal safetyism acts indirectly as a fertility depressing factor. Nobody thinks normally anymore. Siblings looking out for each other is now parentification and deemed a form of abuse. Kids playing on their front yard is, legally speaking, neglect. Playgrounds are now literally soft, and not just those for toddlers, but those for teenagers as well. This is simply not a good development, no matter how you look at it. And again, what's the take those kids and teenagers are going to have? That having a kid comes with 24/7 expectations on you for 2 decades. Legal safetyism has basically made parenting riskier and much harder and with higher expectations than in the 1950s. And then you wonder why youngsters eschew parenthood? The baby boom from 100 years ago occurred in part due to permitless innovation, which led to making family life easier and more fun. That would be the opposite of today, when family life is purposefully made harder and less fun. Safetyism, like any other policy, should be judged by its effects rather than its intentions. And its effects are that it makes life worse, harder, and less fun. And on fertility, it has the effect of making children safer by having far fewer of them being born in the first place. A serious pro-natalist would attack safetyism day in and day out, but they won't, and that won't happen anytime soon either, for reasons I'll get into the next episode. Basically, boomer conservatives who LARP as pro-natalists are in fact structurally anti-natalists themselves, as the overwhelming majority of their positions and ideas about life and social regulation are inherently anti-children, anti-youth, and thus structurally antinatalist. Number 7. Karenism. This one is pretty straightforward. Safetyism can't exist for too long without the nosy Karens to report stuff. The pandemic project was the greatest illustration of this. You had skate parks filled with sand to prevent teenagers from exercising. Up in Canada, teenagers were fined ridiculous amounts for daring to play basketball alone. In my country, the militia fined and beat up teenagers for going out for a stroll with their bicycles. I could go on like this for an hour. Nearly all of these incidents were possible because a Karen phoned in and reported the terrible infraction of playing basketball alone or taking a stroll with the bike alone. Karenism, or how we would call it here, snitching cunts, is functionally antinatalist. The only way to defeat it is for the parents, specifically, preferably the father, to actively stand against the Karens, bully the Karens if necessary, and in the process teach the kid to stand up for himself. I'm actually very glad and grateful that my dad did that. He would lay out the rules and say, well, as long as it's within these boundaries, you do whatever the fuck you want, including to tell the Karen to fuck off. And if the issue doesn't go away, you call me. I'll explain to Mrs. Karen a thing or two. It turned out that very few people really wanted to talk to my father, and of those who did, none of them wanted a second conversation. The trouble is that there are even fewer parents like that today. Parents like my dad were pretty rare 40 years ago as well, but they weren't uncommon. The good news is that this issue is easily solvable, but it cannot be solved online. Number 8. Expectations around housing and accommodation. Okay, this one cuts through both young people and millennials. The common complaint is that housing is getting more expensive. Now, eventually, I'll get to a video about that too, but for now I'll say this. Your expectations have changed radically, mate. Boomers had their first starter home at around age 34. Gen Xers also around age 34. Millennials at age 33. But none of y'all would stay in the houses that boomers got at age 34. You would consider that oppression. Zoomers are already outpacing both boomers and Gen Xers in earning at the same ages, but they're still not even 30, so of course most of them don't yet have a house or an apartment. And most of us who weren't born with a silver spoon lived with roommates and flatmates. The expectations these days are ridiculous. 19-year-olds with no skills at all, not even how to properly talk to people, genuinely think they should be living alone. But that's just ridiculous. Never in history has this been possible anywhere. No, not even the boomers got that. Nobody did. And this expectation is functionally antinatalist because it led to unreasonable expectations. Just 20 years ago, you would date for marriage in which you would build together and get a place to stay. That's more or less what family formation was about. This is how things worked for millennia. The inflated expectations since the turn of the century, however, have balked this arrangement. Sure, the intention may not have been antinatalist, but such is the nature of the tyranny of small decisions. It's not by accident that countries most affected by this are countries where it's customary to kick your kid to the curb at age 18, which is a distinctly neo-Protestant phenomenon seen primarily in Scandinavia and parts of the United States. By the way, there is a reason the most successful immigrant groups are those who favor multi-generational housing. Indian Americans didn't end up being the most well-paid demographic in the country by following neo-Protestant norms. The top 10 best-paid ethnicities by median household income in the United States are as follows: Indians, as in from India, Filipino, Iranian, South African, Lebanese, mixed European, Macedonian, Russian, Austrian, and Croatian. Well, with the exception of Austrians, all of these have in common is a very high tolerance and propensity towards multi-generational households, and very low degrees of neo-Protestant beliefs. Now, of course, mentioning this is common sense whenever I hold this speech in another language, but the second I say this in English, I get the hordes of entitled people whose sole argument is, well, yeah, but I want that. Well, what can I say? Life is unfair. A high total fertility rate environment looks like the 1950s United States or present-day Kazakhstan, which is to say, no McMansions, 3 kids in the same bedroom, and realistic expectations. But how many pronatalists are willing to make that argument? Well, for now, not that many. They'll argue only in vague terms, but never go into the concrete nitty-gritty. Because if they do that, they would also have to go against some of their own supporters. The discussion being dominated by Americans doesn't help either. Americans can't get over the fact that 2024 is not 1954. In 2024, they have to compete with the rest of the world, just like everyone else has had to, well, basically since forever. The unique context of the first 2 decades after World War II was an absolute exception, so arguing from the perspective of that being the baseline is an utter waste of time. This is not and cannot be the baseline because it never was. It was always an exceptional situation. And in 2024, the perceived or concrete realities of 1954 United States are straight up irrelevant to anyone of fertile age in 2024. This is true for both Americans and everyone else. The discussion will move forward when the niche American point of view is relegated to where it belongs, which is to the extreme margins and not to the front line as it is now. And the same argument goes for other ridiculous expectations as well, like the whole discourse on the so-called career gap, which is in fact a very niche point of view and very far from the realities of the vast majority of the people in the West or globally. The very notion of career is illegitimate and irrelevant for the vast majority of people, men or women. Most people don't have careers, they have jobs. Most people aren't competitive attorneys, athletes, or actors, or professions, or doctors, professions that are careers. Yet we're supposed to pretend that not grinding for a corporation for a year or two is somehow a catastrophe with life-spanning consequences, the same way it is for a top 0.001% athlete or lawyer. This is absolutely ridiculous. Yet this mindset is omnipresent in the official discourse precisely because it's functionally antinatalist. But while I understand why corporations pay for it, I'm less sympathetic to regular people who buy into it. Stupidity is a choice. Belief in the line always goes up is a choice. There's room for that too, but if your worldview is one in which you live in order to work rather than work in order to live, then it's a good thing you stay childless. For the moral progress of our civilization, it's objectively a good thing that such mentalities die off, and I'm very serious with this. The fetishization of work as a supreme good, which is the foundation of both Neo-Protestantism and Marxism, needs to just fade back into the obscurity where it came from. Our civilization will be better off for it. But anyway, that's a tangent for another day. For the purposes of this talk, terrible expectations management is one big fertility depressing factor. Okay. And finally, number 9, miscellaneous mythology. Now, we went from trying to convince children to accept rigid hierarchies as fundamentally good to the other extreme, namely to teach children that life is fair. No wonder they came out confused, because life is not fair and never has been. We also went from preparing children for family life as the default to not preparing children for anything. You can be anything you want to be. You're the specialist snowflake that ever snowflaked, is what too many youngsters have heard in their childhoods. Now, the trouble is that that's a lie. No, you can't be anything you want to be. And all of these do create various forms of anxiety. If I had $1 for every time I had to stop a parent from spinning into weird thought patterns about the future of their children, I would be competing, okay, maybe not with Elon Musk, but at least with Bill Ackman for sure. It's natural to think about the future, but it's unreasonable to impose expectations you have no idea whether they're even accomplishable in theory. I see this with urban parents in particular quite often. 3 or 4-year-olds taken to piano classes and practices for 4 hours a day. I'm sorry, but your kid won't be the next Kleiderman and would in fact be better served playing in the dirt with the other kids. These kinds of mythologies, quite frankly, created the helicopter and overbearing parents of today, and this doesn't bode well at all. When kids reach their rebellion phase, as they inevitably do, a non-zero amount of them may end up making antinatalist decisions in order to avoid tormenting someone else the way they were tormented themselves. Now, you may think that's silly, and you may also be right, but I'm not here to judge. I'm just here to say how things work out. So yeah, I suppose this concludes the second part of the series on demographics and fertility. In the third and final part, coming up tomorrow, I'll go into more realistic policy as well as more data. You'll hate that one too, don't worry. But until then, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, send me to the cartels, and I'll see you all tomorrow on the Freedom Alternative.